people appearing.
This is like the little pre-chat, because if we're quiet, then we start getting messages that says we can't hear you. So we keep joking about having some kind of entry music, but Daniel's in charge of that and he hasn't done it yet. Or Jim, you play guitar. You could.
I do. Yeah, I got one here. You want me to do a little musical accompaniment today?
Yeah, we could. You could see, like, speed it up when it starts getting exciting.
We can take requests even.
Maybe that'll be another session.
That'll be. You know what? We should do that. Welcome everybody as you arrive. It's good to see people's names.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We are very excited to be back with you all on this rainy St. Louis day, and especially to be joined today by Rabbi Elizabeth Hirsch, our guest for today, which has been a fun adventure for us as we've gotten to get to know more of our colleagues and bring more voices into this conversation. I do want to just make mention of the fact that you might notice that Daniel Bogard is not with us today. He is currently in Jefferson City, and he would say this a lot harsher than I'm about to say it, because I can imagine the words he would want me to use, but he's there today. There's some really heinous anti-trans healthcare bans that are going through currently in the Senate, which is not going to be our topic of conversation today, but if anyone would like more information, I'd be happy to tell you more and how you can contact your elected officials and all of our elected officials. So he is there today and hoping to try to get his testimony in, and the hearing is happening right now. So we're obviously thinking about him and wishing him well. So this is our latest edition of what we like to call Four Rabbis, even though there's three of us today. And we come together to talk about issues that are pressing to the community, issues that are on our mind, and issues that lead us to delve more deeply into who we are and how that forms the work that we do in our St. Louis Jewish community. And so, as I said before, I'm really excited, Elizabeth, that you're with us today. And I'm going to pass it to you, because as we invited you in and started talking about like what we often do and some of the ideas of what might interest you, you jumped right in with some ideas, and I want to throw it to you to kind of frame it and get us started and get our conversation moving.
Oh, thank you, Rory. Thank you, Jim. It's a real honor to be here. I've been looking forward to this since the fall. And I feel like there's some joke brewing that it's four rabbis, but there's three of us. I do think there's something ironic and kind of cute about that. Anyway, I read that Jews have 6 senses, okay? That there's touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, and memory. And so what I wanted to talk about today was memory, our Jewish memories, because memory really makes me, at least, who I am as an individual, as a Jewish person. And I wanted to talk about the Jewish memories that shape who each of us have become, or who we are we in becoming. And I guess I was thinking about it with Purim around the corner, and which made me think of this topic, because I loved dressing up for Purim. And at my home congregation, which was conservative in Buffalo, New York, I used to get all dressed up with like a long skirt and a fancy blouse and wore way too much makeup. My mom used to put, I guess they call it rouge, put rouge all over, and a little crown. I had very, very long hair that went all the way down my back until I was about 6 years old. And then I would wear all this costume jewelry. Like I'd go through my mother's, basket of costume jewelry and just put on tons of necklaces and big rings and clip earrings. And we'd go to the Purim carnival. And well, first we heard the Megillah and had the groggers. And then we go to the Purim carnival. And my favorite was like the ring toss, where they had, do you remember the old bottles of Coca-Cola with the thin, maybe 16 ounce or 12 ounce with the thin neck? And you take a ring and toss it. And I did really well with that. And I don't know, I was just thinking about making homemade Hamantaschen with my mother. By the way, I'm an apricot filling person. And I was just, all of these emotions were washing over me as we're getting closer to Purim. How I think about that every year. And it's such fond memories of being, and thanks, Rory, to be in the synagogue for so much festivity. And it wasn't a huge shul, but every different room had different games, and you had tickets, and you brought home just kind of some junk that was priceless. It meant so much to me. So that's what got me thinking about the Jewish memories in our lives.
I love that so much. And there's so much to unpack in what you said. First of all, I love this idea of we're about to have a fight, but that's a side note. There's this idea that we have this extra sense of memory. I mean, right, like the ways in which so much of our ritual is about instilling memory. It's like creating new memory, but also sometimes creating these memories that we don't even have, right? Like the Passover Seder, right? How much of that is supposed to be as if like we ourselves have lived through this. But before I reflect on I have to think about which of these memories it's bringing up for me. But one of the things that you got me thinking about was I was recently in Jerusalem in January, and as many people know, right, this whole program kind of started because Jim and I and Daniel and Carney were studying with Hartman, and so I still am. They like to tease me that I have not yet graduated like they have, but so I've still been privileged to continue the study. And we were there in January, and Micha Goodman, who is just one of my favorite teachers and really like a jack of all trades, like a real Renaissance man of a person. He was teaching this class, and part of what he was talking about was that the biggest change throughout history has been the rate at which things change. That was sort of like his thesis, right? That what has changed in modernity has been the rapidness of change. And that if you think about, like, if you were able to go back in time and talk to like a farmer in the 1400s, and you said, like, what do you think the world's going to look like in 100 years? He'd probably say, like, pretty similar to this, right? And like, not to say that there weren't wars or upheavals, but kind of, you sort of knew what to expect life would be like, because it looked very similar to what 100 years before looked like. And it looked like what you think 100 years from then would look like. And that when we think about it, even like 10 years ago, the idea of like what we could have imagined, 10 years from then or 5 years. I mean, now I feel like I can't even imagine sometimes like what 2 months from now is going to look like. It just feels like everything's happening so quickly. But when he said that, what he then said was that Jewish holidays, I thought this was so beautiful. He said that Jewish holidays become an island oasis in the sea of uncertainty. Like our whole world feels like it's spiraling out of control. And then we have these moments where like we come back to Shabbat or we come back to Purim, right? And that becomes this island of the familiar. And when he said that, one of the rabbis in our group, she just looked at him and she goes, "Oh, that's why everyone gets so mad when we change the tunes." It was this like eye-opening, right? But there is, right? There's something about like what it is to kind of go back to that old familiar. So I've been thinking about that a lot, because as you were telling your stories about Purim, it was bringing up some of my own stories. But for me, like hearing the Megillah becomes kind of part of it, right? There's this chant, and we don't change that tune, like that there's that rhythmic chanting that the Megillah has, and I always wonder why. Like I hear it twice a year, but I remember it differently than I remember Torah reading. Something about the Megillah, like it almost is like a song that can get stuck in my head, and sort of year after year, I'm like waiting, and I sort of know when it's going to go up and when it's going to go down, and when we're going to start shaking the groggers, and there's something about that kind of like familiar and what it means to come back to that, especially when it feels like everything else is just spinning out of control.
Great stability.
I love everything you both have said already, and my mind is just spinning with thoughts. First of all, I just need to say this out loud. I'm suggesting that maybe all of our participants today should just take a moment and add in the chat which your favorite flavor of poppy seed. of hamantaschen filling is. I didn't mean to bias
That wasn't fair, Jim.
I know. That was a Freudian
You
slip.
were choosing violence today, Jim.
I don't. No. I want to be very kind and democratic about it. Let's just have an informal poll in the chat. Just all you need to do is type your favorite hamantaschen filling. No pressure, and there won't be any awards unless you get it right. And
I appreciate Arlene saying anything but poppy seed.
Oh, thanks a lot, Arlene. Anyway, on a more serious note, I wanted to thank you, Elizabeth, for bringing this topic to us today, because this is so profound and powerful, I think, for all of us. And I was thinking as you were talking, just many memories were swirling around for me. And Rory, what you just said a moment ago really resonated. I'm reading right now, actually, next to my bed is the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson's newest book called Starry Messengers, which I haven't gotten very far in it, and I'm already enthralled, as I am with everything he writes. And that may sound surprising since he's an astrophysicist, but he's so accessible and so deeply philosophical. And the section I just read this morning was about the power of the rapid exponential movement of time that we are living through right now that has not been historically the experience of the human race. That, it used to take 1,000 years for changes to sort of happen in the world, but the pace of technology is increasing at an exponential pace, so that now today, even within our lifetimes, within the last 20 years of our lifetimes, even within the last week of our lifetimes, there's such dramatic change. And Elizabeth, what I love about you bringing this to our theme today as a Jewish topic is that one of the purposes that our Jewish memories serve is to root us in this ever-changing, unstable foundation of history. And I think that's just so profound, both the rituals, the things, the holidays, but also even the more intangible memories. And I just wanted to say out loud, the one that you brought up unintentionally or intentionally for me, that I would say kind of bubbles to the surface as my greatest Jewish memory. Although Purim and Passover and all those holidays are important, I often think about this without thinking about it. On Friday evening, as my mother, as I was growing up, would sit down and light the Shabbat candles at our table regularly without fail every single Shabbat. And she would wave her hands together, reciting Baruch Hu Shemo, and she would cover her eyes, and we would say the brachot for Shabbat with her and my father and our family. And then she would remove her hands from her eyes, and there would be tears in her eyes. And I remember as a little kid, I don't remember how old I was, 8 or 9, I finally said, "Mom, why are you crying? This is a happy thing, Shabbat. Why are you crying at Shabbat?" And she said, "Because every time I recite the blessing for the candles on Shabbat, I remember my mother when I was a little girl lighting the candles on Shabbat. And I assume she remembered her mother. And I still think about that when we light Shabbat candles, and that power, that visceral power of memory that literally supports us in this constantly rapidly changing world is so incredible. So thank you for bringing this to the table today for our discussion.
That's beautiful, Jim, because as you're really so beautifully explaining, memory connects us to a location or perhaps to a place that may be lost, or it's a location very much in our heart. And wow, we're in such a deep place. I just want to throw out there a less deep moment that whoever makes the best apricot hamantaschen, you can drop them off at my office at Temple Emmanuel. Anyway, so you mentioned.
Let me know when that happens, because I'll come over.
Okay, I'll let you know. Maybe we'll share. So you mentioned the word ritual, which is, I was mentioning to the two of you, and I say this with a big smile on my face. I believe that I come from a blended family. My mother grew up super classical reform, Sunday morning services at Temple Beth Zion in Buffalo, New York. Her father's family came from Austrian-Hungarian Empire when her dad was 9, and the congregation was very kind, and that's where they ended up joining. And my dad belonged to a congregation that was conservative, and he liked the conservative service. But my mother's the one who brought all the ritual to our lives, the lighting Shabbat candles, Jim. And my memory is more that my mother wouldn't light Shabbat candles barefoot. And I never asked her why, but I'm guessing is she thought it was a house of mourning. And literally, if she grabbed a pair of shoes, she'd push one my way because we lit Shabbat candles next to each other. But she's the one who brought all of the ritual into our lives. And it's that ritual that, going back to Rory's comment, that just grounds me. And it's the ritual of, okay, so when the high holidays are over, I start thinking about Passover. When Passover's over, I start thinking about the high holidays with all of the other celebrations in between. But my year is really split into those two halves, Jewishly, all based on ritual. And I know that some of the ritual I grew up with is purely has superstition behind it. But you know what? Like, I wear it like a cozy sweater. And I can't rid it. And it feels so comfortable. And maybe it's because memory implies that we don't forget. And it may not be the actual ritual, but it's maybe the people. I was born without any grandparents. They'd already died. My parents aren't living. And, perhaps having these rituals in my life just means that I'm not forgetting people I never knew or people that I knew, beautifully in my heart. And that's what ritual helps to do for me.
I love that you said that. And I was just thinking as you were saying that and Warren Dansker's very first comment about, our people's obligation to never forget, which often has a connotation of never forget the horrible things, never forget the tragedy, but it's not just that. It's never forget the good stuff either. Never forget the blessing, never forget the privilege. And kind of from a Jungian psychological point of view, the fact that we as a people have this collective memory as well as our individual memories, like our individual memories lead us to individual choices and sweetnesses and sadnesses in our personal lives, but collectively, these rituals are like the manifestation, I think, of that collective Jewish people memory. We light Shabbat candles. We go through the motions of Pesach. We have the Seder, not just because we in our individual family journeys had them. We have our own little quirks and jokes and inside memories, but also we collectively as a people, we don't forget. We can't forget. And we also know we shouldn't forget, which is different than, just don't forget that they want to, that joke, all of our holidays are about, they hated us, they tried to kill us, now let's eat. Right. It's more than that. It's like, of course, don't forget the enemies. Don't forget that. Don't forget that there are those who want to do away with us, but also, even more important perhaps, is do these rituals because they symbolize something beautiful and good and precious and important. So thank you. That's really beautiful.
I can't help but think about how all of the rabbinic writings about Shabbat and the holidays, when they talk about the rules, right? The rabbis like to talk a lot about how we have certain commandments that are commandments of that which we don't do, and then we have the sets of commandments of the things that we do. And they see that on Shabbat, right? They say that there's certain things that we don't do. There's the, and they read it into the two different versions of the 10 commandments. We have Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, to remember the Sabbath, and Shamor et HaShabbat, to kind of guard the Sabbath. But, they say, like, you sort of guard against what you don't do, but you have to remember what you're supposed to do. And I think there's something really profound in that of picking up on everything that you're talking about, right? It's not enough to just push away from who you don't want to be. You have to also know who you want to be, right? It's not enough to just live in a negative. It's what are we proactively doing? What's the beauty that we want to bring into the world or into our lives? And that to me, right, as I think through, like, part of what I love about what you're drawing out for me is that I don't know that I have this one memory, right? They're sort of like, it's exactly, I think, is like both of you were describing, right? It's like, Elizabeth, you were describing like multiple Purims, and Jim, you were talking about like every Shabbat, right? Like each one of these memories, it's sort of this totality of so many experiences that start to come together in our minds that connect us to our past. They connect us to maybe our families, our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors. And then there's also this horizontal connection across the community, because as soon as both of you told those stories, I understood it, because even though I didn't grow up where you grew up, and I didn't go to the synagogues that you, and my upbringing was not like either of you described, but I know what it is to stand next to somebody lighting Shabbat candles. And I know what a Purim carnival looks like. And I know, right? And so like, I feel connected to both of you, even as I never had to actually do any of those things with you, because there's something bigger that binds us. And there's something about that common experience that for me, and I don't quite have the word for it, but whenever I talk about Judaism, that's one of the things that I talk about a lot is both the connection that I feel kind of in this direction of like what it is to go into my past, but also what it is, that communal connection that it builds for me.
And that's when Jim was talking about the Jewish people. It made me think exactly that if I say Passover Seder, we all have very different images, but there's a lot of commonality. And I think that's fabulous. I want to throw out two other memories and see where you guys go with this. One is funny and one is a little more serious. So a lot of people know that I am a very picky eater. I am not a particularly good eater. There's one food like I crave. I love gefilte fish, which would seem odd considering everything I don't eat.
Wait, sorry, hang on. Fresh or jarred? I need to like understand.
My first preference is my late mother's fresh.
Okay.
But I buy like all these jars at Pesach, and I know I eat more than Rob does because I just love gefilte fish. So what would happen is my mother would send my father down to Hurdle Avenue in Buffalo to the fish market to get the different types of fish that she needed. And then we had a split level. And you knew if the heads were left on, if you heard a scream yelling David, and then my dad had to come back and he had to like pack it up and go back to Hurdle Avenue and bring my mother home the fish without the heads. And then she would scrape the bones. And I've never done this. So, but she would scrape it to get every last bit. And then she had one of those things that she had to cook onto the table and grind it. Right, Jim, you know what I'm saying? And she had one, and it clamped literally onto the board. And she made this homemade gefilte fish. And like every time I eat a piece of gefilte fish, so if anyone makes really good gefilte fish, again, you do a mitzvah if you want to feed me. So that is a funny memory of Passover. But in a more serious note, I wanted to talk about the high holidays. So I grew up, again, conservative. And Jim, they do say there's a lot of flavor in the heads, but Helen Hirsch, of blessed memory, couldn't deal with the head of a fish, even though they're supposed to be good luck. And we had to eat herring on New Year's Eve. Anyway.
I was just saying though, I'm totally in agreement though. Like it drives Russell nuts because he will sometimes buy fish and he's like, well, by the time he cooks it, I haven't seen it. But if at any point I have seen the head, I can't touch it.
You can't touch it.
Elizabeth, before you go on with your more serious memory, I just think we need to interject here. And I don't know how many people are aware, the history of gefilte fish actually it was a poor person's food, right. And they did not waste any of the fish. And my grandmother taught me that, and she passed it to her son, my father, of blessed memory, who made the most delicious gefilte fish. But I'm with you, Rory. If I saw, how the sausage was made, so to speak, I couldn't eat it. So I had this visceral refusal to watch that grinder working but it tasted so good. So
it tasted so good. So growing up with two much older brothers and a dad, and it was a conservative congregation. We all sat together. The congregation rented out this big hall because the congregation wasn't big enough. And I used to sit next to my dad or one of my brothers, and I would take their the seat from their talit, and I would just take it and like drop it into my hand. Do you know what I'm saying? like that tactile feeling of the silk. Like I can still feel it today from when I was just maybe 8 years old or younger. And I love the feeling of the old tully tote, the ones that are probably in every synagogue kind of folded up in case somebody needs one, not the gorgeous ones that many of us bring back from Israel, but the really old, either the black and white or the blue and white. And I love the feeling of the fringes. And I would just allow so much of the service to pass as I kept doing that. And sometimes I'm really surprised, as I was thinking about what we're going to talk about, how deep some of these memories are. And most of the memories that I think about in my day-to-day life when I pause to reflect are Jewish memories. I mean, what do you two, if you take the time to think, what are your memories from?
I think for me, I think I would agree with that. I think a lot of my memories are Jewish memories, but to the extent that I guess I think of so much of my life as being Jewish, right? Like so much of what my world is and was structured around was Jewish. And so it all kind of ties, even sometimes peripherally, right? Like I think back to as a kid, I remember going to a lot of baseball games with my dad, but a big part of that was like packing up coolers of food because we couldn't get kosher food back then. Now, we were a Mets family, and so now Shea Stadium, obviously Busch Stadium has a kosher stand. Shea Stadium now has a kosher, or Citi Field now, but it was Shea Stadium at the time, had a kosher stand at some point, right? But like my earliest memories was like, packing up these food, and then having to explain because they would try to stop us, and we'd say no, it's kosher, and then you would be allowed in. Or my dad is an accountant, and for as long as I could remember, he had his own firm where he had like a partner, but he didn't work for a big firm. And so there was this one of his clients was a Chinese restaurant. And I don't remember why, like sometimes I would go with him. Maybe it was, maybe I had off from school. I don't remember why it was like my dad and I, but I would go and he would go and be doing the books. And I would like sit at like the bar in the restaurant before the restaurant was open, but the wait staff was there. They're all kind of getting set up. And the owner like would give me a Coke or whatever it was. And then he would always like slip me $20 because it pained him that he couldn't give us lunch. Like he would want to give us lunch, but he couldn't. It wasn't a kosher Chinese restaurant. And so there was this place, K Roasters. I remember the name of it. That was like down the street or not too far away. And so for a while, like he would like pay for us to have lunch, and at a certain point he'd like slip me the money, and then we'd leave and we'd go, and it was this place where you'd have like fried chicken and like different sides, and so like those are memories of me going to work with my dad or going to a baseball game with my family. And yet like a bunch of the memories are intertwined with the fact of like we had to do it differently because we had different rituals, or and I don't know if I would remember it differently. Like, I wonder if he gave us lunch, maybe it would be a different story. Maybe it wouldn't be as notable as like this person who was like I remember just like, it struck me at how committed he was that he should feed us lunch, that, you might just say like, okay, I'm happy to give you anything from my restaurant, but I can't. So, he would just kind of give me this Coke, but I don't think I would have thought anything of it. And yet like, that sense of hospitality was so deeply ingrained in him that he needed to pay for us to go for lunch elsewhere. And had he fed us lunch, I don't know if how that would have stuck differently. So for me, like, are those Jewish memories? Like, but they are, right? Because like my whole life somehow is tied to that.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, partly that sort of dividing line between Jewish memory or memories that have a Jewish dimension or just memories that may be perhaps secular has to do with the way we were raised. In many ways, Elizabeth, I think my upbringing was more similar to yours than Rory it was to yours. My mother came out of a very observant conservative Orthodox home where my grandfather also prayed regularly, and my mother grew up in a kosher home. My father, on the other hand, came from a very secular, socialist, liberal New York family, although they always affiliated as Jewish and they were always active in the Reform community. But we jokingly also said it was an intermarriage, as you described, Elizabeth. And yet, and maybe this is because of my own path of life, having chosen to be a rabbi, make Judaism not only my personal, but my professional, passion, so to speak, what I do, what I care about, that most of my memories seem to either be explicitly, or as you said, Rory, implicitly, they have a Jewish dimension to them. Not all of them. I mean, I have plenty of good memories and not so good memories that relate to things that really there was nothing uniquely Jewish about them. But often my most powerful memories, the ones that I can call to mind, are based on things that were either explicitly or implicitly part of my Jewish self. And certainly in my own life with my own immediate family, my wife and my children, so much of what we do is woven together with our religious, ethnic, cultural lives, that it's hard to just, I mean, I could go and find an explicitly secular memory easily. I have plenty of those, but they're not the ones that maybe motivate me the most or are tied most to my values. And, another question we were thinking about addressing today, the ones that animate my passion in life, those memories, I think, are more, they have a Jewish dimension to them in some way or another.
So
Go ahead,
sorry,
Rory.
if I could just jump in, because I feel like since you both are talking about these mixed marriages that you come from, I feel the need to say that my parents grew up at the same synagogue. My grandmothers knew each other before my parents knew each other. They were like co-presidents of sisterhood together, and like my aunts and uncles kind of knew each other. And it's sort of a joke in my family, the ways in which my parents intersected but hadn't quite met each other, because they grew up at the same synagogue. My mom grew up in one of those semi-attached houses that has a shared driveway in between it, and she shared a driveway with my dad's aunt. But my parents didn't meet until they were in college together. They were in Hebrew class together. And apparently my dad cheated off my mom, and my mom cheated off the Israeli kid. And whenever they tell the story, my mom says indignantly, they shouldn't have let an Israeli kid into Hebrew class. And that's how my parents met. So my parents very much were not of a, just to kind of counter what you said, although my parents did both. When I say they grew up in the same synagogue, they grew up in the same conservative congregation, and became Orthodox when I was very young. So their families, though, my grandparents, while they were different from each other, though, like there was no sense of those kinds of mixtures, and I just felt like I needed to add that story too.
No, I love that story. But you know what? If they didn't let the Israeli kid in the class, your parents may not have done well in the class.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, Jim, you sparked two things. One about our passion, which I want to go there. And the other is you talked about family, because I was also thinking, Jim, of the three of us, your kids are older than Rory's or mine. And I was thinking about how do we pass along, how do we make memories or exhibit or practice our ritual, so they become memories for the next generation. And I was just thinking that when we took Noah to college for his freshman year, before we said goodbye, he turned to me because he wasn't going to be home before the holidays. And we have this ritual on Kol Nidre where we turn to each other and ask for forgiveness for anything that we've done for, the previous year. And here he is standing like in the middle of a city and asking for forgiveness because he's not going to be with us. And of course, I'm like, no, I have to ask forgiveness. No. And we have this kind of a back and forth thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's taken that with him. I think then he did actually call on Kol Nidre, but I was just wondering, Jim, because your kids are older than ours, what memories or rituals that you see them passing that they've incorporated in their lives. And Rory, on the other spectrum, because your kids are younger, what you see them doing that they're carrying forward, that you and Russell have taught them. And then, Jim, I do want to go on to our passions, hopefully.
Well, thank you. That was really, first of all, that story of Noah, it was like unbelievably beautiful. Thank you. I love what you just said. I was thinking about, I don't have this quote at my fingertips, but I think it was Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, who said something like, I don't remember the exact quote, but I think he said something like, history is his story, but memory is my story. And, or some variation on that theme. I don't have the exact quote. We could Google it and find it, but I'm pretty sure it was him. And I was thinking, to answer your question about, on the one hand, we teach our kids the history, of our story, of our people, of our family, of our nation, whatever, and I never was a particularly great history student, but I am a keeper of memories, very much so. And to my children's, unhappiness often, because I share the memories over and over again. Okay, Dad, we've heard that story, that memory that is so powerful for you. And my kids are not that old yet. My son just got married in October and is in the process now of creating his own family with his wife. And my other two daughters are also, they're all adults and they're all creating their own lives. But I think the answer to your question is that I already see that they, in some ways, even more than me now, are replicating the memories and the stories and the even the bad jokes that I tell, dad jokes that I tell over and over about through things that happen or that I've embellished. That's the replication of memory that we pass on. And my kid, like Noah, the story you described, my kids also are the ones who say, we have to do this. Like we have our little family way we do Hanukkah. When if we exchange gifts, my mother used to write little clues and hide if there was a gift for us. She'd write these little clues and we'd have to go on a little treasure hunt to find our gifts. And so we did the same thing as our kids were growing up. And now my kids, they're all adults. It's the goofiest thing in the world, but they'll sometimes make up a little clue or a little rhyme that gives us the clue as to where to find whatever little tchotchke they got us, or, books. They often give me things like that. And so it's those little things that are the inside family jokes, the memories that are so often attached to, maybe not explicitly Jewish, but they're so Jewish. They're so much a part of who we are. And of course, the more explicit values, like thank God my kids look for synagogues that remind them of our synagogue when they're in another community, because they'll tell me if they found one, oh God, it was so not what we wanted, So those are some random thoughts that came to mind. Rory, I'll pass it to you.
Those are just so great. I mean, I'm just thinking about so much. One of the things during lockdown, I remember there was so much that we struggled with. I'm not going to rank what they all were, but one of the things that I remember thinking a lot about was, how do we make Shabbat different than the rest of the week, right? When we're just in this house every day, all day, every day. And of course, we weren't on Zoom calls and we weren't doing virtual school. I'm thinking about the really early days, right? When we were really just, never left our house. And so it was a really big deal for me. There's a few things. One of them that has always been a big deal for me was that I will not have on Shabbat food that we have during the week. That's a big thing for me. So this is very funny when Russell started doing more of the cooking. When we first got married, I did a lot of the Shabbat cooking. He does a lot more of it now. But we would have this debate over whether or not meatloaf would count as a Shabbat food, right? I just to me, and I don't even really eat meatloaf, but meatloaf is a weekday food. I won't do macaroni and cheese. I won't do any of those things. And if I do, I have to somehow make it fancy. So one time we had for lunch bagels and lox. But we made our own bagels and we made our own lox. We got the salmon and we salted it and we brined it. So there's some sense of that. I make the kids clean on Friday. So the house has to be kind of put back together. And then once things started to open up a little bit, we started to do this routine, and we still do it, where every Friday the kids come home from school, they have to help get the house in order. And then we'll go to the library. We'll get whatever books we want for the week. And then we'll go near the library, there's a bubble tea place. So we'll order bubble tea. And like, that was something we started doing during lockdown. We'll get the bubble tea, we'll come back home, and then usually we'll watch an animated video about that week's Torah portion. And then there's some like family game show or something that we'll all watch together, depending on how much time we have until Shabbat starts. And so, I think about that also, kind of going back to some of what we said, like those aren't necessarily Jewish rituals inherently, right? But the idea of like routine, and that I was like really thinking, if they, like, even if they begrudge it, they have to sort of clean, but like if they always have this memory of like the taste of bubble tea or like something sweet in their mouths, right? Like, what are the ways in which I can make this a positive memory? But the other thing that I was just thinking about as Jim was talking was like realizing, I don't know that I appreciated it as much when I was a kid, but now realizing like how much of the things that I do incorporate like telling stories of my grandparents. All of my grandparents passed away before my kids were born. They all passed away before my wedding. And so like the ways in which like some of the things that I do because I remember doing it with my grandparents and like wanting to tell over those stories. I also have an aunt who passed away that I was very close to. And I really love that sometimes when things will come up, my kids will be like, tell that funny story about, tell that time that Tante Phil did this thing, or, your grandmother. And like, sometimes they're like embarrassing or funny stories, right? But they're like just these ways in which like it connects me. And I think back to like how many of those rituals maybe came from my great grandparents. And I just like, I couldn't appreciate it because I hadn't met them. Right. And so like, what are the ways though that it's still sort of instilled within me? I saw you just put into the chat, the All of a Kind family. I loved those books when I was a kid. And actually they had been reprinted by PJ Library, and I got them and I read them out loud with my kids. I also heard somewhere that I think they might be making a TV show. We'll see if that, but like, it's exactly that, right? Like the mom kind of tries to make these like fun games around difficult things, but it's like, I am really conscious of the fact that we're creating these rituals with them. And I don't know which way it's going to go. Like sometimes I think like, will my kids always, maybe there'll be some part of them that like on Friday, they'll just have this like, need to like fold the blankets and like put everything away properly. What am I kind of instilling? I don't know exactly, but I hope that like part of it again is like being connected to something bigger. Because I think there's some of it that's our family rituals, but all of it connects back to, even if we're the only ones that do bubble tea, but they know that then they go to services on Friday night, or we'll have guests over Shabbat evening for dinner. And that, that's something we're like, all across the world, there are Jews who are now doing Shabbat dinner and celebrating Shabbat. And so we kind of have like our little pathway into it. But I hope that they know that they're part of something that's much bigger than themselves.
Jim, will you take us back to the Passion?
Yeah, I think this is so, I know we discussed it, but now it's even more like obvious to me, at least. Of course, often things are obvious to me and everybody goes, what are you thinking about? But it's obvious to me that this whole topic of how our Jewish memories shape us and shape our families and shape our world. I'm curious. I think I was curious and wondering if, especially because you're a guest now and a new voice on this, our monthly webinar here, Elizabeth, you could maybe lead us into a little bit of like, and using your memories as a jumping off point, or maybe not even, how do you describe your passion as a rabbi? We each have our sort of what, if you had, I don't know, an elevator speech for why you're a rabbi, what animates you in your work? Perhaps because we can't be anything but who we are because of the memories and the what came before us, the heritage that we have. But, I think it'd be interesting for me, and I hope for everybody else listening. They're a captive audience, so they don't have any choice. What's one or more of your passions as a rabbi?
Yeah, really being a house of prayer for all people, and in the best possible way of not having boundaries or exclusivity. So I remember, I can't believe like how much is coming out right now, just talking about this, I remember my consecration, so we were called up by the Israel Levi, right? So my father was Israelite, and I was the third group to be called up. And I was like, I can't believe I'm last. And of course, I got my little Torah, which goes in the sock drawer, which I tell every year the kids have to go in the sock drawer. But that was one of the memories that made me really, or the way the congregation handled interfaith families and who would be recognized and who wasn't. And that's also kind of made me who I am, is about being as inclusive as I possibly can in my sacred community. So that has influenced me. And also this whole ritual, if I could do ritual all day long with my members, and during holidays, I do as much ritual as I can as a community, because as you can tell, that's what drives me. So I think it's ritual based, and then taking people where they are and going where they want to be, or keeping them if they want to stay where they are, and also being a very inclusive community where you can start and stay where you are, or you can grow or be different, and not turning people away or saying, this is where you are and this is where the others are. That's really important to me, to have everybody feeling welcome. So that's been very, very, very special to me.
It's beautiful. Rory, you want to also maybe take a stab at that?
I think for me, it's been access. I want everybody to feel like Judaism is theirs and not something that ever has to be filtered through somebody else. And I think back to, it's funny, you're talking about what are the poignant memories. I remember in high school having a teacher. I was in a Jewish day school, and we were studying halakha, we were studying Jewish law. And the way that I would do it was, not I would do it, my teacher would kind of just write it down on a piece of paper and then photocopy the paper. So we just had this handwritten sheet of these are the laws of Shabbat or whatever. And there was one point where I came home and I said, oh, I learned today that you're supposed to do X or you're not supposed to do Y. I can't even remember what it was. And my brothers were like, prove it. Where did you get that from? And I was like, I don't know. It's on this sheet of paper. And I remember getting really upset because I remember feeling like my brothers were being kind of really hostile about it and really aggressive. And I remember getting really upset. And at one point, my older brother was like, listen, we don't mean anything by it. That's how we're taught to study. Right. And realizing I had a very different methodology, right? Because they had the texts and they had the books and they could go in. And if somebody said something, then they had to say well, because Rambam, Maimonides said it, or because, Rashi said it, or whatever it was, they had to prove it. Well, I didn't have it. I just had this sheet of paper with no citations. And years later, when I was in college, somebody had told me about a tshuva, about a responsa from Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I thought, well, I'm really curious to see what it says. They told me sort of in general what it said. And so I went and I found it. But I couldn't read it. It was all in rabbinic Hebrew, and I hadn't been trained in that. And so I went to one of my brothers and I said, could you read this with me? Would you study this with me so I could understand it? And this was my younger brother at the time. He still is my younger brother, but the other story was my older brother. Now it's my younger brother. And he looked at me. I just remember he looked at me and he said, why do you want to know what it says? Right? There was this sense of what's going on. And what are you going to do with it if I give this to you? Or so for me, those are some of what drives me, of everybody should be able to have access, and that this is for everyone. And regardless of gender, and then, by extension, for me, that was sort of my barrier, but, background in Hebrew, background in knowledge, but then also, sexuality, status, intermarriage, whatever, all that stuff. If somebody wants to be able to access the tradition, then how do we create a space where everybody has a pathway for that access, and that we can clear that space for people to really find it in their own way and at their own pace?
In so many ways, the two of you just were mirror images of the same passion, in a sense, and I certainly would echo that as a passion as well. As I was asking the question and thinking about us talking about it, I would formulate my own version of it a little different, but it's actually the same. It's coined from the same mold in a sense. I remember, and again, this is memory, but I realized today that this is sort of who I am because of this. My grandfather, of blessed memory, on my father's side, my father's father, who was this socialist reform Jew, and yet was fluent in Yiddish and read the Yiddish newspaper every day and went to the Yiddish theater and was very ethnically Jewish. I mean, I learned most of my Jewish food loves from that side of the family, ironically. But he, when I was very young, he had a motto. His motto, and he used to talk about it. He was an attorney for the state of New York, and he was really passionate about justice and fairness. But he said, Jimmy, every single human being is born into this world with a right to dignity and respect just because they are human beings. And I can remember, I can hear his Brooklyn accent saying it because he was born on the Lower East Side, but grew up in Brooklyn. My father and his brothers grew up in Brooklyn. And I can hear that, that passion that he said, and that became intentionally or unintentionally. And it was unintentionally at first, but now it's intentional. It's sort of my passion. And the older I get, what I spend my time on has changed in my job and in my world. Like I became a rabbi because I was a passionate youth worker, but I was a young rabbi. Like I was young and I was cool, and I'm not young and I'm not cool anymore, but I still am passionate about that, but now my passion is to address different needs in the community and different demographics in the community. And I've become more interested seriously in education and learning. But at the very core of it is this passion for dignity and respect. And I can't help but going back to, when I became bar mitzvah, I was Parshat Balak. So I read the famous story of Bilam and, the talking donkey and all that. But the Haftarah I learned, which was really the important thing I learned as a 13-year-old, was from Micah chapter 6, where he's, what does God want of you, human being? What does God want? Only to do justice, and only to be kind and merciful, and only to walk in humility in the presence of God. And for me, that's my passion. Not that I achieve it, because I'm human and I fall short all the time, but to strive to do that in my life and in my work.
That's beautiful. We're all becoming, aren't we? We're not expected to complete the work, but neither may we desist from it. And that's, I don't know how much time we have left. I just wanted to ask, because I love symmetry and just needing kind of bookends. If when we get close to the end, if we could each share one more favorite memory, that, Jewish memory. I don't know, Jim, do you have one that you haven't shared?
Sure, I'll start quickly. But thank you for that. And Elizabeth, thank you for bringing these topics to us today. I think it's been really beautiful and rich for us. A quick memory, I like all of us, I know I have so many. The joy, we were a singing family. My mother was a professional musician. She sang opera, but she also was a music teacher in elementary schools and at the synagogue. She was just a very talented musician. My father really wasn't a good musician, but he loved to sing off key and loud. And that's what I remember. But I can remember, and my mother and father both were born and raised in Albany, New York, not far from you, Elizabeth. And I remember Pesach Seder, late into the evening. We had a long Seder as a family because my mother's family, they really loved Pesach. And so we always did a very traditional long Seder. But near the end of the evening, I can remember us singing. I don't know why this memory came to mind. It's not that profound, but I can remember us all sitting around the table. The adults, I think, had 4 very full glasses of wine, and the kids were exhausted. But I can remember us singing, El B'nai, B'nai Beis, singing Adir Hu. But in our family, we didn't sing it that way. We sang, Albany, Albany is in upstate New York. And that's my memory, as ludicrous as that is.
It's making us smile and happy and filling our hearts, Jim. That is fabulous. And isn't that great that was the random memory that just washed over you?
I am just like, yeah, that's just so fabulous. And I will say, so yeah, this is a great way to start to wind down, and we're coming close to an end. We are going to end a little bit earlier today because fortunately Jim does have a funeral to get to, and we're obviously always hard days when that comes up. But I'm going to go back to where we started with Hamantaschen, actually, because I don't know if Elizabeth, you kind of brought it up, but I think that was one of the things that specifically, when I was a kid, we used to go to my grandmother's house and we'd bake Hamantaschen there. And at a certain point, it was my mom's house, and our house, right? I was a kid and my grandmother would come over, and then, it became my mom's job to lead it. And then when I was in college, I started bringing friends home. I remember the first year I asked my mom if I could bring some of my friends, most of whom were not Jewish, if they could come and bake Hamantaschen with us. And my mom, I think she picked like 3 weeks before Purim. And I didn't know at the time, but later I discovered that she had done that assuming that she was going to have to do it all by herself. Like we were going to be useless and we were going to make this big mess. And then we were going to, she was going to have to do it all by herself the following week. So she kind of, gave herself some extra time to do that. And I brought these friends home and they were great. Like they got super into it. But like one of my friends, Brianna, she was like quality control. Like she would be looking around and she would say, okay, guys, like one cherry, right? Like none of this 2 cherries, they're opening up, 1 cherry, right? She'd take them out as, she would be seeing, and then she'd be like, pinch harder, you're not closing them. And then for years after, my mom would say, like, is Brianna coming? And so all through college, I would bring friends home, and then sometimes different friends. And then even for years after, when we lived in New York, my friends from college would come over to bake Hamantaschen. Obviously, like there was one year, I think when I was pregnant with my oldest, we all baked Hamantaschen, and then somebody set up a surprise baby shower at my house while we were all baking Hamantaschen at my mom's house. And so all my friends were there and, kind of moved over. But one of the really poignant memories I have, I mentioned my aunt who passed away, my mom's younger sister. And I was already living in St. Louis, but I had been in New York, upstate New York, for a conference over a Shabbat. And I think like Friday, we sort of knew like my aunt had taken a turn. And I was sort of, by Saturday night, I said, maybe I should change my ticket and stay, like, not come home, not fly back to St. Louis on Sunday. And somebody was driving to a subway station, and well, you're saying, Jim, like they're all joyous here. This one's a little bit more mixed, right? So we were driving to the subway station, and as he dropped me off at the A train in Harlem, I got a call from my dad that my aunt had just passed away. And so, I got on the subway and I went down and I went to my mom's house, and like everyone was over. I mean, it just sort of happened. Like my brother and sister-in-law and my nephews were all there. And one of my other brother and sister-in-law were there, and my sister-in-law's mom was over. And I didn't quite even understand. And I think at some point I realized, because it was a few weeks before Purim, that they had come thinking that they were going to bake Hamantaschen, and then, kind of realized how bad things had gotten. And I walked into the house and I just saw everyone like sitting around quietly. And I walked in and I took one look and I said, Phyllis would want us to bake Hamantaschen. Like my aunt loved baking Hamantaschen. I mean, there were like pictures that we had of like my mom and my aunt throwing flour at each other, or my aunt like threatening my mom with like a, when the word's escaping, the
rolling pin.
Rolling pin. Thank you. I was like rolling wheel, rolling pin. And so I just was like, this is what we're supposed to do right now. Like we're supposed to bake Hamantaschen. And it was a few days until the funeral. My aunt passed away in Massachusetts, and so there was stuff that had to happen until we were able. The funeral was in New York. But and so like those memories also, I think, like the ability for them to carry us through even in like the really difficult times. And there was like something about baking a Hamantaschen, and it was melancholy. Like we were obviously sad. I mean, we love my aunt very much, and like we were still like sort of laughing and I'm still like helping my nephews make a big mess, and sort of knowing like that's what my aunt would have wanted. And that's part of what it does also, is like help us to know what to, when you sort of feel lost, like it's the next step that you get to take, right? Like, and maybe that also is sort of where I was saying about that island of calm in the sea of unknown. Like when the world feels like you don't know what to do, sometimes like we get to go, like that was it for me. Like it was this moment of this like, huge, scary unknown that was happening around us. And then there was like, here's this tangible thing. Like all we're going to do right now is just bake the Hamantaschen. And it was really like one of my, I think about like that memory of baking Hamantaschen with everyone in that moment. And like, it is a beautiful memory for me.
Elizabeth, you should share yours before
Okay, thank you, Rory. You made Phyllis's memory a blessing. That's what we do, right? You've made her memory a blessing by sharing this remarkable woman with all of us, and with the smile and the love and the flower. So I want to just end with an Elijah's cup. Okay, a cup of redemption, a cup of hope. So again, I'm the youngest by many, many years. It's funny how we've got all these Passover memories as well. Sit around the table. We've always had dogs. So we get to and so I'd spent the first part of the Seder looking at my mother's stemware, a goblet, and it was all etched. I don't know if your mothers or grandmothers had etching, and it leaves. And like, I spent the entire Seder like staring where the wine was. And I knew, like, I remember what leaf it was at, how far, like, I had it committed to memory. And then I'd have to go to the door to answer the door for Elijah. The dogs were barking. So of course, Elijah was there, because why would the dogs bark? And I'd get back to the table and the wine was always doing this. It was moving. So then I couldn't find where my eyeball had made it. And I have to say, like, if I could ask my father anything, I'd ask him if he kicked the table, because the older I got, I always wondered if he kicked the table. Do you know what I mean? Or just shook it a little bit, because I believed, I still believe, I so believed that Elijah came to our house and took a sip of that wine, Manischewitz. And I just want to believe that my dad gave me that faith and that belief.
That's so beautiful. And I can't help but offering counterbalance to that story, Elizabeth. And I'm a little scared to say this, because it's kind of like saying, there's no tooth fairy or there's no Santa Claus. And we all know there are. But when I was about maybe 10 or 12 years old, we lived out in a rural area outside of Kansas City, and most of our neighbors were not Jewish. One of our closest friends, my father's closest friends, lived right next door, and it came to the middle of Passover Seder, and it was time. Our tradition was the youngest child, or one of the younger children, would take Elijah's cup to the door and open the door and hold the cup at the door, so that Elijah didn't have to actually come in. He could just stop by and take a sip of Elijah's cup. And I opened the door as we were all singing Eliyahu Hanavi, and looked out, and I saw our next door neighbor, Pat, whatever his last name was, standing outside in the dark. He had just come by to say hi. He didn't know it was Passover. He didn't realize it was Seder. So he reached out and took the wine glass from me, and he drank it and handed it back to me. And I turned and came back and sat down at the table and showed everybody the empty cup. And my father was like, "What just happened?" And we had this dramatic moment. And then Pat came in and joined us, and we called him Elijah for the rest of the time we lived there. So I don't know who was actually, I think you got the real thing, and we just had Pat to play the role of Elijah.
I think we all get the real thing.
It is a shame that we have to draw to a close right now, because I could go another hour just talking about Elijah stories and our true and pseudo Elijah stories, and maybe that will be like a part 2. Elizabeth, we'll have you come back and we can do that, because I have so many now at the tip of my tongue. But we are gonna draw to a close here, and just thank you all for joining us, for spending your lunch hour together. Thank you, Elizabeth, for inspiring us to just go so deeply. I feel like I've gotten to know both of you better, and I feel like I've gotten to know myself a little bit better, and also really grateful that I got to share a bit about my aunt, and we can tell more stories about that sometime also. But really, thank you for inspiring this conversation and opening us up, and we look forward to all of you joining us next month as we continue with wherever these conversations take us, because we never quite know where it is, but wherever we go, it's somehow incredibly profound and eye-opening for us. And I think has been really just such a beautiful journey. So I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will see you all soon.
And thank you.
For the invitation. Bye.
And Elizabeth, thank you. And